Hello, everyone, and welcome to SIEPR, the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research. I'm Mark Duggan, the Trione Director of SIEPR, and all of us here are so happy to host you at our first event of 2024. Apologies if I'm a little sniffly, but I tested. I do not have COVID, so anyway, I will try to keep my head down and not. I'm really thrilled to have Professor Emily Oster with us here today. She will be talking about COVID-era learning loss, a subject that has hit many of us closely as parents and also as economists and people who are focused on public policy and long-run implications, who are thinking of how millions of children will reach adulthood and the labor market with a pretty major disruption in their early education. I will properly introduce Emily in just a moment, but first I just want to briefly mention a few other things that we have going on here at SIEPR. As many of you already know, we draw faculty from across the university who are interested in focusing on some of the most pressing public policy issues of today. We also support many up-and-coming economists through our Young Scholars program and provide research opportunities for undergraduates, graduate students, and pre-doctoral fellows. We work very hard to connect our scholarship and research with the journalists, policymakers, business leaders, and community members so they have access to research-based analyses that can inform better decision-making in government agencies, corporate boardrooms, and beyond. We also convene these audiences with events like this one today, and our very biggest event of the year, each year, is the SIEPR Economic Summit, which is happening right around the corner on Friday, March 1st, and I'm hoping to see many of you there. We have a really terrific lineup of speakers, keynotes, and moderators, including NVIDIA CEO Jensen Huang, former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, Ford CEO Jim Farley, new Federal Reserve Board Governor Adriana Kugler, and Kevin Rudd, Australia's ambassador to the United States. We have more events on the horizon too, including with the president of the San Francisco Federal Reserve Bank, Mary Daly, and with the deputy managing director of the International Monetary Fund, Geeta Gopinath. These events help showcase the broad spectrum of important economic and public policy issues that our faculty and students focus on, and today's talk with Emily Oster is another excellent example of this. A few of our senior fellows, Susanna Loeb, Thomas D., and Sean Reardon, have been studying different aspects of learning loss we've seen since the onset of COVID, the closure of schools around the country, and the scramble to make up for lost time. Emily has been doing this as well. She was a visiting scholar at SIEPR during the 2017 and 2018 academic years, and has been looking at how student test scores dramatically declined in the US during the pandemic. She'll talk with us today about how students have recovered, what factors are playing into the pace of that recovery, and how that recovery varies across states. Some of her recent work, which has been covered by many leading media outlets, has showed that states across the US have seen a rebound in math test scores over the past 2 years, while in English, language, arts, some states made gains while others have fallen even further behind, but she'll tell us more about that. In addition to her research on COVID-era learning loss, Emily is incredibly well known for her efforts to help parents make better decisions using data and evidence when it comes to raising their kids. She is a professor of economics at Brown University and the author of Expecting Better, Crib Sheet, and The Family Firm. Her academic research focuses on health economics and statistical methods, and she's interested in understanding why consumers don't always make rational health choices. She received both her bachelor's degree and her PhD in economics from Harvard University in 2002 and 2006, respectively, and currently serves as the associate editor of the Quarterly Journal of Economics. I could go on and on with Emily's many accomplishments, awards, publications, positions, and so forth. I had a walk with her before this when I was remembering that I first met her when she was a graduate student at Harvard about 20 years ago, and she was just an amazingly creative and researcher, and I'm just glad to have known her in the years since. She's the founder and CEO of ParentData.org, a website and weekly newsletter on data, pregnancy, young kids, and whatever's on the mind of parents. She was named to the 2022 Time 100 Most Influential People list, and her next book, The Unexpected, hit shelves in April 2024. it is really such a huge honor to have Emily Oster with us today. After her presentation, I'll kick it off with a few questions for her, but then we'll open it up to questions from all of you. So thank you so much for being with us today. And most of all, please join me in welcoming Emily Oster to CEPR.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Mark and CEPR, for having me. I'm really excited to be here and talk a little bit about COVID and schools and parenting and all the other weird stuff that Mark highlighted that I do. Okay, so what I want to do in this talk is sort of go through a little bit the landscape of COVID and schools during the pandemic, and then what is happening both post-pandemic, immediate post-pandemic, and long-term post-pandemic with test scores. So I want to start, it's perhaps difficult and challenging to cast our mind back to March of 2020, but in March of 2020, when the pandemic started, basically every school in the US and almost every school globally closed for in-person learning. And that closure, at least in the US, was true, basically every school was closed until the end of that academic school year. And at the end of a typical academic school year, you would get a sense of how kids were doing by the standard state assessment testing that happens in every state that I'll talk about later in the presentation. But in 2020, no kids were tested at the state level. So in some sense, it was a little bit of a black box in terms of what had happened over those 3 months. In fact, I think our best evidence about kind of what was happening in that immediate term is this. And so let me tell you what's in this picture, because I actually think it both tells us what happened in the first 3 months of school closures, and it is more or less the entire story of what happened with school closures for the rest of the pandemic. So to understand this graph, you need to know what Zearn is. So Zearn is an online math platform that many schools use. It's a curricular math platform, not an enrichment platform. So it's built on top of the Common Core. So a school district would use it as a kind of primary approach to math instruction, and kids complete lessons. And the typical kid is intended to complete, say, 2 lessons a week. And at the end of the lesson, there's a little test. You can't move on until you've done the test. And when you do the test correctly, you get a badge. And you earn a badge. So a kid is supposed to earn badges. You're supposed to earn like 2 badges a week, and that's the system. And so what this graph, and this is a graph from Opportunity Insights, from Zearn data as evidenced, as put together by Opportunity Insights, they've taken the Zearn data, and they've looked at, relative to a baseline, how many badges are kids doing. So this is really a real-time metric of how much math are kids completing. And so you can see that kids are completing, like a good amount of math. It's kind of going in and out. Kids are kind of, here's maybe the February break. We're doing a little less math. And then here is the school closures. And the 2 things that come out of this are, first, there is a lot of reduction in math learning when schools close. And it continues, it does not rebound. So schools closed, and then there was some effort at Zoom school for a few months, and it doesn't really seem like that did too much. And what's striking here is, I will note, this is an online math platform. So if you ask, what's the easiest thing to move to Zoom school, you would think it was something you were already doing on the computer. And yet, there is a lot of loss. The other thing that is happening here is that the kids in the low-income school districts are losing more. So for the low-income school districts, you're seeing about a 70% reduction in the amount of badges that they're earning. That's a 70% less math for that period. And so these 2 features, that in-person schooling is relevant for learning, and that the kids who are the worst off financially and also in terms of their test score performance are losing the most, that is the rest of the story. So this pattern, which we saw immediately as of sort of June 2020, just continued over basically the next school year. So it's June 2020. Schools are now closed effectively until schools are going to reopen for the 2020-2021 school year. And here is the sort of second phase of kind of what happens with schools in the pandemic. So there is an enormous amount of variation across the US in how schools opened in the fall of 2021. And there were a lot of different reasons for that. One that was pretty salient is in July of 2020, then President Donald Trump said schools should be open. And he said schools should be open, I think not for any particularly evidence-based reason, not with any particular citations. It was a thing he decided should happen. And the result of that was that any momentum in blue states towards trying to figure out how to reopen pretty much ground to a halt. And the reopening of schools bifurcated along party lines, other lines also, but party lines being a very important one. And so at the end of that school year, the team that I was working with spent a bunch of time trying to collect systematic data on which schools were open and which were not. It turned out a lot of that data was collected as part of a school food program, and so there actually is pretty good data on this. And I'm not going to talk about how we got that data, although I'm happy to talk about it if you want. But just to give you a sense of what happened, here's a map of school district opening in November. So red is closed, blue is in person, yellow is hybrid. And so what you can sort of see here is that more or less the red states are blue and the blue states are red. It's not quite that simple, but it turned out political leanings were a really, really important determinant of reopening. There are some exceptions. So I live over here in a state so small that it doesn't really appear on the map. But in Rhode Island, which is a very blue state, schools actually opened pretty uniformly. And then there are some exceptions like Kentucky, which may not be, it's this one. Kentucky was quite closed, despite being a red state, but by and large, you sort of see these patterns in which political leanings really determined reopening. And that was true not only across states, but actually within state. So if you asked, what are the things that made you more likely to have access to in-person school? It's living in a more Republican school district or state. It's being richer. Those are basically the things. So kids, poor kids, black kids, were much less likely to have access to in-person school. Richer kids, suburban school districts that had less students of color, school districts in red states, those kids got access to more in-person school. This is November. By the time we get to April, there's much more reopening. So there were school districts, actually many of them in California, that stayed closed for that entire school year. But on the whole, there was some sort of more push to reopen by the end of the school year. So that's the pattern of opening. One of the things we wanted to do with these data when we first got them was think about how does this reopening or not reopening relate to pandemic learning losses. And the first time we get a kind of cut on what happens with learning losses is in the spring of 2021. So in the spring of 2021, many states do assessments, not every state. So in a typical spring, every state will test basically every kid in a state level assessment. In the spring of 2021, some of them did that and some of them did not. But for the states that did, we can look at how much they lost in terms of learning, and then we can try to relate that within a state, within an area, to how much in-person schooling they had. So here's a sort of first kind of cut look at that. There's two things here. So these blue dots represent the change in pass rate. So states have a passing threshold. That's kind of the metric of how kids are doing. And so when those go down year on year, that's bad. So the blue dots are the change between 2019 and 2021 in pass rates. And so you can see that in both math and ELA, every state in this sample goes down. Some of them go down more than others, so this isn't a mistake. So in Virginia, there was a 30 percentage point drop in the share of kids testing proficient on their state tests in math over that 2 years, which is really like a lot. It went from 56 to 26, something like that. The drops are smaller elsewhere. The drops are generally much larger in math than in ELA. This is like a standard finding in this space where for some reason math is more responsive to There's different reasons this might be, but math tends to be more responsive to school quality, things about school than English is. And the second piece of this here is you can see we've just broken down in a correlational sense the sort of looking at the correlation between how much of the time the school district was open, like the share of the year it was in person, and the losses. So you can see the places that had the smallest amount of time in person had the largest losses. Now, if you are coming into this audience as an economist, what you're going to tell me is like, this is a correlation. This is, how do I know this is causal? I think that's a fair question. When we wrote our paper on this, we dove into quite small areas. So what we showed is that this pattern, that more in-person schooling was associated with less learning loss, is true even if you look within a commuting zone. So even if you look, the example I like to give, which works well where I live, maybe it doesn't work as well here, is in Providence, in Rhode Island, there's a Providence and there's Pawtucket. And they're right next to each other. They're so close that I run into Pawtucket every day. And the Pawtucket School District was closed for a lot of the year, and the Providence School District was not. That's the kind of comparison that we're trying to do in our regressions. In our analyses, we're trying to basically ask, within these small areas where otherwise the circumstances of the pandemic would have been quite similar, to what extent are the school closures seem to be correlated with learning losses, and it seems like they are. And consistent with what you see here, it's more true in math than it is in ELA. So the effects are larger in math than they are in ELA, and they're big. So the sort of consequences of being closed all year were large. So what that tells us is that in the spring of 2021, there are big gaps. And those gaps are larger for students who were students of color and students who were worse off in terms of their test scores and in terms of their income before the pandemic. And that's actually true for two reasons. So first is that students who are in more disadvantaged groups were less likely to have access to in-person school. In addition, in the data, those groups suffer more from not having that access. So there's a kind of additive sense in which the kids who have the lowest test scores to begin with, both are less likely to have in-person school and then lose more as a result of not having an in-person school. So the impact of the pandemic is used to widen these pre-existing and already quite large and now even bigger inequality gaps, more so in math than in ELA. So it's 2021, spring, things aren't going great. Now there is an opportunity though for recovery. And I think the thing that we are sort of interested in at this point is asking, okay, we have test scores from 2023. So we've now got 2 years in which there is an opportunity for recovery. How are places doing? And the answer is, it varies. So this is a graph, this doesn't have every state on it, but it has some sort of exemplar states. And so the red dots, so this is ELA. So the red dots here are the change from 2019 to 2021. So how much did this state lose in proficiency rates in the sort of first pandemic year, in the first cut we get on like what happened. And then the blue dot is how much did it change from 2019 to 2023. So if you asked where are we in the most recent data relative to where we were pre-pandemic, are we still down? Have we caught up? How are things going? And the answer is, in ELA in particular, there is enormous variation. So in a place like Washington, they were down about 11 percentage points in the first year, and they've crawled back like 2 percentage points. So they're like tootling back there, but it's still like 9.5 percentage points down from where it was in 2019, which is pretty big. There are other places like Minnesota and Massachusetts, which not only did not recover, but actually have continued to worsen. So Massachusetts is down another 4 percentage points from where it was in 2019, which is not good. And then there are really like significant success stories. So here's Mississippi, Tennessee, South Carolina, Iowa, and places where there was some loss. So I think in some sense, like Mississippi and Massachusetts are a really interesting comparison. because they both lost a sort of similar amount in terms of these pass rates, and then they kind of went in the other directions. Now, before you're like, oh my gosh, let's move to Mississippi, the best ever, it's important to remember that these tests are not comparable across states. So it's not the case that Mississippi kids are performing better on national tests than Massachusetts kids. What we are seeing here, though, is that in these changes, there is some kind of recovery happening in some of these places that is not happening in other places. And I think that idea is, at a minimum, worth thinking about. And so one of the things we've been spending some time here on is trying to understand basically what's going on here. And if you are a person who's like a little steeped in some of this space, one of the things you will notice about Mississippi, Tennessee, and South Carolina in particular is they're all kind of right out on the frontier in terms of the science of reading stuff. So these are all places that very early on, like 2014, 2015, moved their curricula in the direction of using more phonics and less balanced literacy, which is increasingly clear that that's quite important. Is that what's going on? I don't know. There's 3 data points. Very difficult to get a low p-value with your 3 data points, but it feels suggestive. I will say you get almost none of this variation in math. So in math, everyone's kind of slowly trucking back to where they were before. Very few places are all the way back. There's very little variation. It's all just kind of like we're moving back. There's really the ELA variation is very stark. Okay, so the last thing I wanted to say is one of the, and then I'll talk to Mark about questions, is that one of the things that has really frustrated me in this whole process is the lack of data and in some ways the lack of transparency. I think that when we put up, so we've been putting together these data basically by pulling down the state test scores when they put them out and putting them out in like a Substack newsletter, which feels like not a great way to get information out. And so one of the sort of latest thing that we have tried to do is to try to leverage the AI, it's very hot right now, try to leverage that to make some of these data more accessible to a wider variety of people. So we actually, the team that I work with sort of put together the state assessment data, so these data that I was just showing you the graphs out of, and we then had a team put an AI front end on it. So you actually ask questions of the data and get out graphs and tables. And so if you think that sounds fun, you should go visit Zelma. To give you an example, so I just said, Zelma, 3rd grade ELA test data in Illinois, and then this is the kind of thing that the AI puts out is, the proficiency rates over time. And so ideally, this is a way for people to basically use natural language queries to learn about these data and to ask, how have things changed over time? How are things changing in my district or in the schools in my district? And what do the racial gaps look like here? So, so we're very excited about this possibility of sort of using this to both help people learn more about kind of what's going on here and also like candidly to make states produce better data so we can have more visibility into what's going on, which is my ultimate goal. Okay, I'm gonna stop there. We have like such a big water
more
glass.
water, a lot of water.
So great.
In case you need, I think that's plenty.
Nice.
So that was great. I learned a lot there. I just have a few questions for you, and I encourage all of you to open up with your questions too. So one question that I have has to do with what if, so you've sort of read a lot, and this is just related to the issues that you've been talking about. One thing that's really striking to me in K-12 education in the US is the just amazing stability in the share of kids who go to public schools. Okay, so if you look in 2020, 91%. In 2010, 91%. 2000, 91%. 1990, 91%. Like it has just been flat, like 9%, maybe sometimes 10%, maybe sometimes 8% of kids go to private school, but it's been amazingly stable. And one thing that I heard, again, like read articles about and just talking with people again and again, was a frustration with people that many people had with schools, and that it in many cases encouraged them to sort of look elsewhere. Mm-hmm. And so I just wonder to what extent you think did this jolt K through 12 schooling in any way, or did it lead to a little bit of an uptick here and there in private school enrollment? Do you see what I'm saying? So
yeah, no, I do, and I think it was something people talked about a lot in sort of mid-pandemic, because it is true the private schools were open more, and that was true not just the sort of Fieldston, Horace Mann kind of private schools, but the Chicago was a good example where the Catholic, the Archdiocese opened schools first thing as soon as they could in the fall, and the public school, the CPS, did not really open much until sort of April or May. And so there was a sort of is everyone going to move? And I don't think ultimately that is going to turn out to be a very significant shift.
But it's kind of amazing, that it has remained so stable for so long.
But there are significant changes in the balance across public schools. I mean, charters have become a much bigger portion of this. Magnet schools have become a smaller portion. So within the public school landscape, things have changed quite a lot. Yeah. You're right, the private school stuff has not moved as much.
Okay, great. And another just related, so in Econ 1, recently I was talking about employment in the US and private sector versus public sector, and public sector is 1 in 7 workers, and the biggest category of public sector workers are teachers. And so I think that teachers were very affected by the pandemic, obviously. What's your sense of whether and to what extent this has shaken up the teaching profession also? So, there were some, I'm sure it varied a lot geographically, but what role did teachers play in this, rather than just school superintendents or governors or mayors, that kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a hard question what the sort of long-term implications. Certainly the teachers union played an important role in both closures and opening at different times. So I think there was initially school closures definitely lined up sort of along union versus non-union lines. I think, when you got to January, February, Randy Weingarten pushed really hard for a school reopening. I don't think would have happened in many blue states as much as it did without her thing. So I think the role there is pretty complicated. Whether that will have long-term implications for how schools and teachers operate, I don't know.
Right, okay, super interesting. And the data that you presented, I don't know what grade they were from. Do you have a sense?
The test scores are 3 through 8.
3 through 8. So, I mean, one of these things, the pandemic, the effect that it had on education, K through 12, and for that matter, college, community college, it was huge, right? So it's a little hard to figure out which group was most treated. And so I'm curious, from what you've read, do you have a sense of whether this mattered much more for kindergartners or 4th graders or 8th graders or 12th graders, or is the evidence really mixed there too?
So I think, in the test scores, what we can say is the sort of effects are a bit larger for the younger grades, although it's a little hard to exactly interpret because the cohorts are moving around. So I think there's not much there. My guess is what we will learn is that the way this affected you depended on where you were in school. And so, kind of if you were a kid who was going to drop out of high school, then you were going to drop out of high school. So I think we'll see sort of changes for high school students that are about kind of completion or moving on to college. I think the middle school kids, I don't know how much you learn in middle school, but you definitely learn to be with other people. So I think some of this kind of socio-emotional stuff is probably more important for some age groups than other age groups. So I don't know. Part of why we ended up collecting all the data about the closures is because we thought sort of long-term it was going to be useful to have that so people could correlate it with other stuff and give some grad students something to do in 2040,
Data will be very useful. Do you think that the pandemic has made, so one of the challenges I'm sure you've encountered this as an economist, is getting data from government agencies to assess stuff, whether it's schools or public safety or healthcare or Lots of things. Is it your sense that this huge shock to the system has made data more available? So you have this tool, which you're trying to actually make data more available, though, harvest the data that is available. But what's your take?
No, I don't think it's made it more. I mean, I think the only reason we were I don't think that the data has become more available. My experience of this was very much that like having any individual particular, if the state had a particular person who was going to be helpful, that was great. I mean, at some point, like Idaho mailed us a thumb drive because they said that like there was not enough space on the internet to upload the PDFs that they had, and then they were just like, "We'll mail you a thumb." It was like, okay, I mean, but like Linda, it was great. Like Linda put some stuff on the thumb drive, and she mailed it, and so that was nice. And then we had data from them, but it sort of felt a little bit like, arbitrary. Here I am building this like AI front end, and like Idaho's like mailing me a thumb drive. Like there's something missing in the middle. Like I don't know, Dropbox or something felt like right in the middle there.
I do think one challenge, right, is I can't remember the number of school districts. There are 13,000
school districts.
13,000 school districts in the U.S. So that
and they don't have to report you. I mean, one of the issues we had with data from California was that like the state does not have a lot of control over the school districts. So like during the pandemic, if they wanted to know if the school district's open, they just like asked nicely, and if the school district didn't call them back, like that was it. They couldn't learn about it. And so we only were able to fill in our like pretty map of California because of this other thing called the Pandemic EBT program, where the state, a different organization in the state was required to collect this information so they could decide which kids were getting money because they didn't get school lunch. And so that was only because of some money thing.
Right.
So usually if there's money on the line, you get better data.
Money will help.
Money will help.
Money will help with
money
data.
will help.
So I'm going to encourage people to start thinking about questions. And I would also like to ask you not just about this, but some of the book that's on the horizon. I don't know, we don't want to get any special spoilers or anything because I know it's still coming out, but some of the other things that you have written. But I wonder to what extent it is the case that schools, obviously, kids took a big hit to their learning, more in some places than in others. And one concern that I have is that for many kids, they're kind of just now behind, right? And so to the extent that the curriculum hasn't adjusted to take account of the fact that, okay, our kids now are starting from a different base, because it has always been true. I think, I'm not an education economist, but my understanding is that it's well known that if a kid took a standardized test on June 1st versus September 10th, that they lose some learning over the summer. So this was like
called the summer melt.
The summer melt. Okay, right. So, but is it your sense that this is sort of there will be scarring effects of this, or is it the kind of thing that will just?
I mean, I think this is part of the question of recovery. Like, if you could recover faster, we have some ideas about some things that might improve, recovery. I mean, we know something about high-dose tutoring, and there's other things you could imagine doing. If we don't do those things, then you're going to be behind forever. And I mean, there's some interesting sort of spaces for research. This company, the Zern, that where I started with the slide, has sort of tried to think a little bit about if a kid basically missed fourth grade math, are you better off, like in fifth grade, putting them in the fifth grade math and then backfilling the parts of fourth grade math that they need to know, or are you better off like just putting them in the fourth grade math? And it turns out the first thing, putting them in the fifth grade and backfilling, seems to be better. So there's some opportunities for research to do stuff like that, but yeah, I think if you don't learn to multiply, like that's it.
Right. It's just hard to catch up.
It's hard to catch up.
And so, okay, so great. So I will pause here. I've asked a lot of questions, and I think that there are many people in the audience who know more about K through 12 schooling than I do, but I want to open it up to see if there are questions that others have here in the audience for this before I pivot to asking her about some of her books. Questions from the audience right here. Let's get the microphone.
Thank you. Do you have data that would suggest, by demographics, mostly income, about Mark mentioned the real constancy of private versus public. I only have anecdotal information. I work in East Palo Alto with very poor people. Most of them are undocumented. I have been inundated with questions. Will any Catholic schools take their kids? because the Ravenswood School District was an epic fail. And these are undocumented. They're not unloving and they're not stupid. And they want the best for their children. I've been flooded with these kinds, and I've been involved with the Archdiocese of San Francisco, school board, all that kind of stuff. So it's a topic near and dear to me. Do you have any information about that which would rescue it from the anecdotal?
Not really, no. I mean, I think one of the things we did sort of, I tried to get a lot of data from the Archdiocese during the pandemic because they were sort of an interesting case of kind of being open in a lot of for serving a very similar population to a lot of the public school districts. And I think for a bunch of reasons, they're sort of holding that a little close to the vest. So I don't, it's a really interesting question, but I don't think we have good data.
One thing that I really like about what you're doing with the geographic variation is getting a sense of who did well and who didn't do well. And one thing that's somewhat frustrating, especially when you have over 13,000 school districts in the US, is that there's really not, and this is kind of true in a lot of things, healthcare, criminal justice, like how do we get best practices to diffuse?
Totally, it's so frustrating. No, it's it's frustrating to even think, forget about the 13,000 school districts. I mean, I showed you that graph where it's like South Carolina's over here and Massachusetts over here. And it's like, could you call them and ask them what they're doing? You know, and I think, and occasionally I've had these like really weird conversations where like Massachusetts will be like, what do you think South Carolina is doing? It's like, I don't know. Like, why don't you call them?
Right.
Like, it's like, aren't you meeting frequently? And so I think there really feels like there are incredible opportunities for learning about best practices across states, within states, across districts, whatever it is that we are just not doing because this is such a sort of siloed. And it became so clear during the pandemic when districts were trying to decide whether to open at all, right? Because there was no information about like how much COVID, what should we have, masks or fans or ventilation, can you put a box fan in? And the superintendents, basically every individual superintendent was responsible to some extent for that decision. And you know, they would tell me things like, I'm on a WhatsApp group with like 7 other superintendents and we're just like trying to work it out. And that doesn't seem like a great way to be doing public health.
Right, yeah, no, absolutely.
I do like WhatsApp.
Okay, other questions that people would like to ask? Back in the back, Jeremy. Professor Bulow, you get the microphone.
Thank you. Emily, I was wondering if you could comment on the theories about this difference between math and ELA, because if you'd asked me, I would have predicted that there'd be less of an issue with math, and I'd obviously been completely wrong.
Yeah, I mean, so if you look at like the charter school literature on like sort of what is the difference between charter schools and we do charter school lotteries and so on, the math effects always show up more strongly in those studies than others. So I think that's the sense in which I was not surprised to find this, because it suggested to me that like there's something happening in school. And I think what's harder to know is how much that's about like deep math learning and how much it's about like the tests are like specific to some way of doing math, whereas an ELA test would be more like a reading comprehension, which is a little easier to imagine sort of scaffolding at home. Like it may be just the way they want your kid to solve this, or the way they're structuring this particular question is very specific to what we do at school. And so even if you were trying to help your kid during the pandemic at home, like you don't know about the new math, you know, whereas like reading is sort of similar. But I don't think we have a great sense of that. It's just a pattern that appears in the data in other places.
Great, okay, there were more questions. We've got a question right up.
Phyllis tried to answer.
Okay, sorry, Phyllis. We've got a question right here. Chris, up here. Let's give you a microphone, Phyllis.
I have a lot of questions, and I can't roll them all into one. I'm looking at your talk, and it says learning loss in the U.S. Where are we now? Was that what exactly was the objective of your study? You probably said that, but I wasn't paying.
So I think we're just trying to understand. We're trying to understand both sort of what happened in terms of learning losses, and then what is going on now in terms of recovery.
Okay, in order to do what?
In order to try to figure out how we can help people recover more.
Oh, so that is objective.
Definitely.
To see, the continued recovery
Definitely.
From COVID-19.
Yes.
Okay. And the fact that lower economic areas did poorer than others is a continuation of the knowledge base that we've always had.
Yes.
So that was not a surprise one way. There was nothing
Right.
particularly surprising about that.
I
Same-
agree. That's true.
Okay, so
Yeah.
that was the same. So there was no surprises in those areas as far as what
Were
happened.
there no surprises? I mean, I think there's things in the data that I would say I found surprising, or at least I think are useful to know. I think some of the cross-state stuff I wouldn't have predicted.
I'm surprised, Phyllis, that my home state, so I spent my first 28 years in Massachusetts, and if you had said to me which state would do just about the worst, I would not have put Massachusetts
Really?
high on the
No, I
list.
wouldn't have
So I
either.
would have thought Massachusetts would do a lot better. But it is, yeah, anyway.
And it says, where are we now? What would your general statement be about where are we now?
That's a good question. I mean, I think we are not as good as we could be, is kind of how I would say it. I mean, I think that there is more recovery to go. And we should be trying to learn from the places that are doing a good job and try to move that knowledge to the places that are still struggling.
And so what needs to happen next after your survey? Would you?
I don't know. I think people should talk to each other and try to, this is the best practices point, I think.
So
is a good one.
so for example, South Carolina seems to be doing really well, and so that is
Yeah, I
something
mean, there's
that
a
I
lot
think-
of different explanations. I think phonics is one explanation, but I think there's a bunch of stuff we could
Right.
do. Maybe we should.
So there's more work. Yeah, I think there's more work for people to do here. We've got another question back here, and then behind her. Yeah. So next this row, and then behind her to the right.
Thank you for your talk. I was curious to know about if you could design the study that you think would answer the most important questions about what this matters for long term. I know the talk was opened by posing the prospect that we care about what happened during the pandemic, in part because it affects what happens to kids when they reach their adulthood, and their potential labor market outcomes. So I was curious, how you might think about understanding the effects of the pandemic long term, and whether if recovery, as we see, is more successful in some places than others, whether this might not matter ultimately long term.
Yeah, no, so I've been thinking a lot about this. I think it's a great question because actually, because there's so much variation in recovery, a lot of the sort of ideas I had, which were okay, there's this variation in how much you lost, which is some of it's about reopening, and later we're going to be able to regress other things on that. Because there's so much variation in recovery, there's way more noise in kind of how people are experiencing this than the sort of linear recovery that one had imagined. And so I think there is going to be an interesting long-term question about whether there is any empirical strategy that will help us answer the question, how are kids affected and how were people affected? Because it's, how do you separate the pandemic from the schools, from the whole thing sort of seems very, very messy. And so I'm not sure what the answer is, how I would design my optimal study. I don't know. But it's a great question.
Right behind.
Hi. Yes, I am thinking about the role of missing people in this story, and I'm thinking about 3 levels of missingness. Chronic absenteeism, I'm hearing, is higher than ever, possibly, and so missing students. I'm thinking about missing teachers potentially due to the teacher shortages and teacher morale that may be lower now. And I'm also thinking about missing family members due to the mortality incidents of COVID itself, and children literally not having adults around them that they're used to seeing. And I'm just wondering, thinking about those 3 categories of missing people, do you have any information or insights into how that might be playing a role in what we're seeing?
Yeah, so it is great question, and there's a lot of missingness in all of those places. And I think it's sort of, I can answer like the academic answer to that, which is like when we sort of think about things like the relationship between closure and test scores, the initial test score drops, we thought about the missing students and we thought about the missing family members. And part of the sort of attempt to sort of limit to smaller comparison areas was to try to say, look, the pandemic experience in these areas was more similar and the school closures were different. And the missing students, it turns out, I think for the most part, actually the biases associated with that in the regressions would go the other way, because the students who were less likely to take the tests tended to be students who would perform worse. There's a sort of recovery piece of this where I think that of those sort of three things, the one that we are going to be talking about the most is the absenteeism piece, because that appears to be continuing. So that is not just a problem of 2021 or 2022. The absenteeism rates at the moment, I think, are much, much higher than they were before. And so that's something we're going to have to grapple with, well, maybe when we think about testing, but also when we think about just like what's the experience kids are having at schools.
Okay, question over here with Chris.
You may have answered the question, but to be more specifically, are you saying that the two data sets before and after COVID are impacted by an acceleration of students not coming back in the public schools? In California, anecdotally, it's 10% or something like that of the students are not there that were there before. So did you adjust for that in the data sets?
Yeah, so we tried to basically bound based on that. And in the states that we were using in these grades, that number was small. In the testing, the sort of total, the drop in the number of students in the school year was relatively small. There was actually a drop in the sort of share of kids taking the test. I think we bound a little bit with that, but I think it turns out that a lot of the people who didn't end up taking the test actually were the students who probably would have performed the worst.
Or correlated, they may have gone to private school, opted out. So that's what that.
Right.
I think you're probably right. It probably was more on the low end.
I think that piece of opting out was not as big a deal in most of the places that were not California.
Great, John, a question right here.
Thanks, Emily. So the data that you were showing us was changed since the start of the pandemic. Am I right in my intuition that Massachusetts losing 10% and South Carolina increasing 10%, South Carolina is still way behind, or am I wrong on that?
Yeah, you may be right about that. I mean, I think that's not like, I think what we were like, there is a sort of deep question, which is like, who cares if Massachusetts is so far ahead, they could lose a ton and it would still be okay. I mean, I don't think
I don't want them to lose, but I still think they're
yes,
probably
the
blowing
the levels will be largely preserved, and South Carolina and Mississippi are going to do worse.
So I'm just trying to help out Mark here
right.
a little bit.
Yeah, no, Massachusetts is still doing fine. It just could be doing.
No one feels bad for Massachusetts ever.
No,
All right, Chris, but then we'll go over here and then we'll come over to Brett. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to change gears just slightly because I'm a huge fan of your books and how you've made economics accessible primarily to parents and a lot of moms. So, and if you guys don't know, like her 3 books, give them to people who are having babies because they're really good and they're evidence-based. So you have a 4th book coming out. What's it about, and what's next on the writing front?
So the 4th book is called The Unexpected, and it is about pregnancy after complications. And so it is really a book that was inspired by the people who talked to me who had something happen in a first pregnancy, a miscarriage, a stillbirth, a preeclampsia, something that made it really hard, and they're thinking about embarking on another pregnancy. And so it's about data on recurrence and data on treatments, and also about how to have conversations with your provider. So it's co-written with a very nice doctor named Nate. So I'm very excited, in part because I think it will be useful for people, in part because I think it will force people to have some conversations about topics that we don't talk enough about, and that's something that I try to do. And so yeah, that's next on the writing front, and then just more parent data writing. Gotta tell people about tongue ties and other things that occupy the mind of parents in the middle of the night. I basically want to be there when you're Googling. When you're panic Googling at night, instead I want you to panic Google parent data and just go back to sleep. That's my goal, more sleep.
We've got a question right here. Yeah, I think you. Yep.
Hi. Well, thanks for all your parent data. As a non-parent, I still find it really interesting to read and learn about. Maybe that's just my brain. But I do work with students with disabilities, and we already talked about some learning inequities, and I was just wondering, it seems like we're not totally measuring kids who are already not at grade level.
Great.
And maybe where they are now. It also seems like we don't know what's working, which is what I'm most interested in. So do you know anything that I might not know about kids with disabilities and where they've landed?
No, I think that I don't know anything that you don't know. One of the things that we've got in Zelma or are putting in is the breakdowns by students with disabilities. So I think if we can get more of that data at the state level in an accessible way, maybe we can learn a little bit more about what happens. But that's a hard population because the testing doesn't always show up in the ways that we want, and the population that's tested is not, we don't really know anything about learning anyway, and so this is just like it's hard.
Brett, a question here, right here, and then behind in the back. Yeah.
Going back to COVID, I appreciate the U.S. data. I was just curious if you looked outside of the U.S., compare and contrast to specifically Sweden, who took kind of a different tack than most countries.
So there was a little bit of data on, so most of the rest of the kind of developed Europe and so on was open much more than we were much earlier, and so there's a little bit of work from Europe about sort of test score losses in like the spring, basically. But by the time we got to the next school year, like school was interrupted and so on, but there wasn't the kind of widespread closures. So to the extent that we see some data from there, it sort of kind of lines up with this. And yeah, it's true. Sweden was like one of the only places where there were parts of their school system they basically didn't close at all. And I think subsequently I think opinions could differ, but many people think that was a successful approach. But in terms of the test score stuff, we don't have as much there's not as much variation.
Question back.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm a clinical child psychologist and I'm a huge fan, but even more as a mom, and I'm a huge fan, so thank you for all of your work. So I'm gonna do the annoying thing and ask a question about data you may not even have and that weren't part of your presentation. But so I'm in pediatrics and oncology, and we know that for kids who have any sort of stressor outside of even just COVID, that rates of anxiety and depression were escalated. And for the general population of kids, those rates still haven't gone back to pre-pandemic levels. And so when I also spent the bulk of the pandemic at the Medical University of South Carolina, so I'm surprised and chagrined because I didn't agree with some of the stuff they were doing, but look at their data. So I'm just curious if you have any data on that, if any of that ended up in analyses that weren't presented, but the relationship between psych factors.
And it is a piece of this that I think we are it's very hard to get that kind of data. Because I think what you really like is kind of like behavioral diagnoses within schools. I think you sort of need the school system data because almost any kind of even like electronic medical record is going to be a sort of particular population that's kind of not generalized. So one of the things we pursued at some point, but just is not accessible in a broad way, is like kind of behavioral infractions, like some kind of thing that's not quite like anxiety and depression, but sort of gets in the direction of kind of things that are happening that are not test scores, but that stuff is not accessible in a way that one could get it.
Question over here. And then I have a question or two for you when we wrap up.
Hey, so I understand this is impossible with the data that we have access to, but a lot of this is looking across states and across schools, but it seems like for teachers and for school systems themselves, the majority of the problem will come from within the classroom, right? You might have somebody in a 5th grade classroom who really missed out during the pandemic and now they're at the 4th grade level. There might be somebody who got private tutoring or something like this, maybe less so in private schools because it's more homogenous, but definitely in public schools, I think that's probably true. I don't know if the Zern data allows you to look at that in any sense or what your perspective on this is.
Yeah, so that's a great idea. So you are right that there's a lot of heterogeneity, and you're also right at the sort of underlying implication that like the hardest thing to do in a classroom is teach a classroom of kids who are not at the same level. Like that's just by far the most difficult thing, no matter what age the people are. The Zern data is actually a great place where one could learn a little bit about this because it's got this sort of granular school level, like sort of kid level data. There's also, NWEA does like map testing, which in principle sort of goes inside the classroom. And when people have done some of those analyses, they tend to find like, this is not about heterogeneity, but that like the kids who were sort of worse off to start with, whose like test scores were lower, they've kind of lost the most, whereas the kids at the top have kind of basically like the 90th percentile is kind of where it was and the 10th percentile is not where it was, which suggests that whatever heterogeneity you had before, it's gotten bigger. But Zern data is an interesting idea. I had an interesting idea for how to get at that.
So I have a question for you just about K through, John, did you have a question?
Yes.
Okay, why don't you go and I'll see if mine has time. But John, go ahead.
Did you see any indications of recovery rates between higher income, mid-level income, and lower income? My hypothesis would be, my hunch would be, that the high-income students would recover more quickly.
No.
But that would be because they get tutoring. But did you see any data?
Not at the level of the school district. So whether that's true at the level of the student, I would have the same instinct. At the level of the school district, the drops are larger in the lower income school districts, partly because they tended to have less in-person school, but there isn't a lot of heterogeneity in recovery rates at the level of income, at the district level.
Okay, thanks.
So I just have a question for you, just thinking about K through 12 schooling in the US, 13 some odd thousand school districts, 50 million kids-ish. There's important talk about all the time how important it is. Do you think it's getting better? I'm just like, I mean, COVID is a factor, but the first person I ever invited to speak at CEPR for my first summit a bunch of years ago was Wendy Kopp, the founder of Teach for America. And I kind of asked her that question, like, is schooling getting better? Has it gotten better since you started in I think it was right around 1990 when she started it. But and what are the big questions we should be asking? So we talked about COVID, which is extremely important, but I'm just curious, your take. You've now read a lot on schooling, and it is, each district is kind of scrambling, sort of reinventing the wheel, I feel a little bit like, and it's frustrating. It's frustrating when I see how much, let's say, the Amazons of the world are harnessing the benefits of big data to get better and more productive and more efficient and deliver more value. You know what I mean? And then when I compare it with,
Amazon to run your school.
No, I don't want Amazon to run the schools, but I'm frustrated because when I look at the schools, I don't necessarily see data delivering just in the public sector generally.
Yeah.
Governments harnessing data to get better, more efficient, relentlessly better.
That I
all the time.
agree with. I don't know if like the Amazon style approach to this is going to work so great, but I do think.
Good.
I mean, I'm always going to be on board with the idea that like if we had better data, we could learn more, and that there could be ways to make it easier for schools to get that data. I mean, I think part of what is up against is like there's 13,000 school districts, and we think about school districts, we're thinking about, New York City or Chicago, we're thinking about places with, their resources are stretched, but there are a lot of people there. And, New York City does have good data, whether they're using it to learn, I don't know. But, many of those 13,000 school districts are 3 people. It's the superintendent, there's more students in that, but the superintendent's also the bus driver, and he's the principal of the high school, and there's just one these are small places. And so in a sense, I don't know, what do we expect the people who run those school districts to also be experts in data entry? I mean, that seems insane. And so I think there is scope for trying to use some of the world of data and better tools to make it easier for places to learn. I don't know if
who will do that? Yeah, it's not obvious.
I don't know who will do that, right? Because I think that there's the sort of the local guys are not equipped to do it. The state level, I think there is more of a push, and it's more common when I talk to people who are in the state education offices that they are like, we're trying to get data, we're trying to do this, we're trying to do that. So maybe that's the place. I think the federal government has too little control. Actually, the Ed Department has too little control over the states to be responsible. They just kind of got to live at the states.
Okay, so we have an event at CEPR on sort of the future of cities at the summit in 4.5 weeks, involving one of the panelists is our mutual friend Ed Glazer, professor at Harvard.
Great.
Right, he's going to be one of the panelists. But we have a panelist who's a mayor from Dallas and a DA from San Francisco. But I'm just thinking, what questions should we ask them about schools
They
and
have
how to
nothing
get
to do
better.
with schools. Don't ask them about schools.
Mayors. Well, I guess
That's
DA.
not-
I know the
that's like
DA does,
nothing.
but not the
It's like-
mayor. The
I
mayor?
wouldn't waste your time on that. No, I
No?
know, definitely not, because that's not where, this is exactly the kind of thing he's gonna say things like, schools are the most important thing that we have. We love our students, right? It's like, there's no control vested in that person for the school.
So where should parents be directing their efforts? Just local school boards, I guess.
Local school boards, or like I would push the state, if you want better data, you push the state education agencies. Those are the guys who are getting the data.
What's that?
Public attitude until you convince public that teachers are more important and education is more important than, say, football.
Right.
Yeah.
Football.
Yeah.
Millions of people watching their children be educated.
Maybe Taylor Swift is the answer. Maybe somehow there's something we could be using.
That seems like a great note to end on. So with that, thank you everybody for joining us. Thanks to Emily for coming. It's fun to see you.